Welcome to another episode of PEP Talks, the Patient Engagement Podcast, the podcast that explores patient engagement in patient-oriented research. I'm your host, Sandra Zielinski, and today we're diving into a crucial yet understudied topic, the mental health challenges faced by immigrant youth in Alberta, Canada. According to Stats Canada, 37.5% of Canadian youth from immigrant families encounter significant barriers in accessing mental health support. With limited data on youth mental health in Canadian immigrants, this episode sheds light on their unique struggles. As of 2016, over a quarter of Canadian youth belong to visible minority groups due to the increasing immigrant population. Youth from migrant backgrounds, including immigrants and refugees, grapple with distinctive factors affecting their emotions, social life, behaviors, and mental health. This episode of PEP Talks explores the specific challenges these young individuals face, including poverty, trauma, displacement, and discrimination, highlighting often overlooked aspects of mental health. Today, we have the privilege of speaking with Farwa Naqvi, a master's student at the University of Calgary. She'll be sharing insights from her mixed methods thesis study, delving into the lived experiences of immigrant youth, their priorities, and how their voices and insights can drive positive change to shape improvements in healthcare. Welcome, Farwa, to PEP Talks, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to have you as a guest speaker. And I'm just wondering if we can start off by sharing a little bit about yourself and why you decided to work on this research topic.
Hi, Sandra. Thank you so much for having me. So essentially, I came to Canada as a refugee and came to Calgary because my uncle's family lived here, and it was quite a culture shock. First of all, the weather is a huge shock in itself. Whether you immigrate from, Asia, Australia, anything, Canadian winters are completely traumatizing in itself. But it was a culture shock when I first came to Canada and then Calgary. It was not as big of a metropolitan back then. And I came from a bigger city. So just a lot of different things you needed to get adapted to very quick. Another thing I noticed when I first came to Alberta was there was more diversity than other places that I've lived. It was quite multicultural even in 2003. I cannot imagine now when people are coming from various countries to see so much diversity in race, gender identity, and whatever else. So kind of bringing it back, for me, it was quite a bit of a culture shock when I came here. Obviously, I did grow up in North America for most of my life, so it wasn't like a perspective that I could share with possibly someone who was 16 and came here from, let's say, like Uganda or something, right? But regardless, the growing up in Alberta, in Canada, as someone who comes from a refugee immigrant background was a bit surreal and definitely did impact different facets of my perception in approaches in life, as well as my own understanding of my mental health. And so what led me to this was eventually, after finishing my undergraduate degree in community rehab and disability studies, which actually touched on mental health quite a bit, but more of like mental health is only discussed in a clinical sense most of the time. There's so much psychological as well as social nuances to mental health, even perspectives directly from the person being afflicted with their mental health issues, rather than, we need to get them on this prescription, etc. Well, why do they need to come to that point for some of the illnesses that they face, right? I really wanted to explore that. What better project to work on than hear directly from immigrant youth, refugee youth in Alberta right now, and understand, well, how has that displacement impacted your mental health? That was a broad sense of what I was trying to gauge.
How old were you when you came to Canada? Were you school age?
Yeah, I was in elementary school. So
Okay.
really, most people are like, well, when we talk to you, we can't really get a sense that you are from an immigrant background and everything. But obviously, you learn accents, you learn the dynamics of like Western society very quickly. You adapt very quickly, especially when you come at a younger age. Now,
Mm,
if you're older, it's kind of even harder. But when you come in an elementary school age, you not conform, but adapt. You become a chameleon in some sorts. Yeah.
And kids are just like little sponges, so they
Yeah.
learn so much quicker than, adults and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your project?
Yeah, so essentially the project started off with Maria Santana, who is our primary investigator, scientist in pediatrics. Brian Steele, who was a research assistant at the time in our team, patient engagement team, and Tiffany Barboza, who is the community engagement coordinator. Without these three people, this project would not have come to light. So essentially, they also noticed that there was a gap in our knowledge based on immigrants in Alberta and their mental health perspectives. Obviously, all over Canada, there have been projects done similarly in bigger cities, like let's say BC or Toronto, where it's a hub for, migration and stuff. But Alberta is still a bit understudied. So all three of us got together and we're like, okay, we need to explore this a bit more. So essentially, the first thing that we did was Tiffany and Brian and Maria and Paul, who is also our assistant director. We got together and sent out a survey, really all over Alberta, for immigrant youth to just give us an idea of their age, um, their um, their background, etc. And we had a little text box in the survey. And in the text box, it was, what questions do you have in terms of your mental health? Simple. That's it. They could put anything and everything in that text box. When we received these text box questions back, Tiffany and Brian and I, we went through all of these questions and we found some questions to be quite similar. So, like, for example, some kids would be like, what resources can I find in school to help me with my mental health? And then somebody else, another youth in Alberta would write, how can I support my friends with resources in Alberta? So yeah, very similar things. So after repetitive review individually as teammates and collectively, we really categorized these questions down to a smaller level. And then we also had a steering committee. And in the steering committee, it was comprised of, people who are also doing their graduate studies or are in the field of immigrant youth populations, community or organizers and facilitators. So the steering committee comprised of these individuals. And just for peer review, we wanted their approval, their inputs and stuff, just so we make sure we're being very transparent in our combining of these text box questions. Eventually, we came up with 25 questions. 25 unique questions that were not the same as the others. That was our final question that we present. So following that, quite simply, Tiffany took the reins on that. And because she's a community coordinator, she reached out to a lot of the community organizations all over Alberta. So we're talking rural Alberta, which we also wanted to acknowledge. Their perspectives are very different than urban, right? So we did Calgary, Edmonton, Cold Lake, Brooks, Red Deer, Lethbridge, everywhere where we could get a response. So that took about a year and a half really to recruit all these youth. So Tiffany connected with these organizers and said, hey, we would like to connect with the youth who come to your organizations and stuff. Do you think you could, let them know that we want to hold a focus group? And so these youth, some organizations collected 15 youth to participate, while some only like 4 or 5. So it was like different in each area in Alberta. It was a bit tougher in communities where there was less immigrant populations, of course, right? But urban areas like even Lethbridge, a smaller metropolitan, we managed to get a good amount of youth. So after Tiffany communicated and recruited these youth participants, that's when we held the focus groups. And so these focus groups, we did 13 focus groups all over Alberta, and 12 of them were over Zoom. This was because this was right in pandemic times, and there was no way for us to really, first of all, facilitate these youth, find a place that's available during COVID times. So we did them all virtually, except for one, which I will discuss on later on, was Brooks. Brooks was the only place in Alberta where we had to do the focus group in person. My experience between the virtual and the in-person, very unique. So essentially we had about 89 to 90 something kids participate in our focus groups. And yeah, we got amazing feedback from all of them, and really got a good sense of what these youth want prioritized in terms of their mental health. And so the last focus group we did was a nominal group technique, which is a unique sort of lens for focus groups. And this focus group I did with actually people who work in the field, not just academics, but also, again, community organizers, facilitators, etc. What do they think about youth mental health? And is it paralleled with what you think? Is it ironic? Is it what is it? So essentially, I did the NGT and came up with the answers, that the priorities that these youths and these organizers had. I just wanted to preface this, which I left off. The methodology that we used for most of the focus groups was the James Lind Alliance approach.
Mm-hmm.
And in a nutshell, the James Lind Alliance approach is equitable. It puts researchers, patients, everyone in the research study on the same level. We want to hear directly from the patients, hence why our team is patient engagement, person-centered care. We want to hear from them. It's not our assumptions that matter. And the James Lind Alliance approach actually follows the pathway that I told you. You find general questions, you combine them, then you present it to the participants, and then they decide what priorities they have. So the 25 questions, if I want to get nitty in it, is the 25 questions were presented to these youth, and these youth were in a discussion for a little over an hour, sometimes less than an hour, of what priorities they want, their top 5 questions that were combined. What top 10 questions are the most important to you? So essentially all 13 focus groups did that. We presented the 25 questions to them, and then they would prioritize their top 10, their top choices of what they want Alberta, the system to acknowledge nationally, maybe even internationally at some point, what matters to them right now in between 2020 to 2023, 24. Yeah.
Did you take into consideration that it could be tricky for youth to talk about mental health, and then how did you designing your research methods so that you could best engage with and capture their experiences and insights and priorities in a safe and comfortable way?
That's a great question, Sandra. And the first and most important thing is participant safety mentally, because when we prioritize their mental state when asking them sensitive questions like that. So essentially, we started off with a very thorough consent form, which gave them details that, hey, you have to let us know you consent. Obviously, ethically, you have to do that. But also, we gave them information that should they feel uncomfortable at any time, should they want to step out or not participate anymore at any given time, they're free to do so with no repercussions at all. That was already a preface for them. And even when we started the focus groups, again, we prefaced it. So far, none of the youth left. But at the end of the focus group, we also gave them resources of all kinds of relevant, for example, like Calgary, the distress center, etc., kids helpline. And then for other more rural areas, we found like services and supports for them in their locality, which would support them if they were feeling any sort of distressed disposition throughout the whole focus group. Now, the focus group itself, the questions were very vague, that they just needed to prioritize. Them having anecdotes or having commentary was completely on them. Now, if somebody made a comment about what they felt like in their own personal situation, they're free to do so because this is the place to do it. We want to acquire this knowledge to help them. And youth would, repeat, like have a conversation sometimes and stuff, but it never came to a point in which I felt like I needed to step in to stop a conversation or, note that they were feeling distressed. Just a little thing is obviously having a virtual focus group inhibits you to really convey their most genuine thoughts. First, you could turn the camera off so people don't know how you look like. Also, we can't observe any gestures, any body movements, anything like that. Also, if they do feel like talking, a lot of them, I'm talking 60 to 70%, used only the chat function. So they didn't actually ever speak at all. Even though we asked them to introduce themselves, we also gave them the option to introduce themselves over chat. So some of these youth actually never heard their voice just on the chat if they wanted to. If we asked them what priorities do they want, they would say number 8, number 9, like that, right? They wouldn't even make any comments. So having a virtual platform for focus groups was a little interesting because there was not as much of a depth as much as I would have had as I did in the in-person focus group, the only one I did. So in that sense, they felt a bit more safe. To wind back to your question, yeah.
That could be a whole research in itself that you can unpack, because one of the things with focus groups is, as much as you try to encourage confidentiality, it's not 100% because you're working with other people that are joining the group who could go out, even though you say like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, people could still go out and talk about so-and-so said this or so-and-so said that. So it does, in some ways somebody could change their online name and just be a little more anonymous in that environment, which may provide a space that feels more comfortable for some people to join, right? Because they, and youth maybe have a little more discomfort than adults, just because of, I don't know, they might be thinking, oh, what if someone from school is here or sees this or hears about it, or, you know what I mean? Like things like that, where they have other worries going on. But with that being said, there's nothing like working together with people in person. Just the dynamics that happen, the engagement, the conversations, the reading and feeding off each other, like body language and just building off each other. It's a totally different dynamic than online, period. Also, people are at wherever they're at their house or some, and, things can be happening in the background. When you're in person, you're there, you're present, you're not distracted by other things. So perhaps that provided like that safety and comfort that people needed in order to kind of take part in what you were doing. Can you share the importance of integrating voices of youth from various backgrounds who may not have been able to share or express their thoughts on mental health before?
Yes. So one of the organizations that we reached out to was CWA, which is Canadian Immigrant Women's Association. So the youth that participated in our focus group with them were strictly females, female identities. Obviously, they could be transitioning or anything, but they identify as females. Siwa caters to female immigrant populations, and these ladies' perspectives were very different than, let's say, we also did the Chinese Benevolent Society, which is up in Edmonton. Now, the youth from the Chinese Benevolent Society were actually second, third generation immigrants of Chinese descent. And so their parents were even born in Canada, but they self-identify as immigrants. Their identity and their approach to mental health is certainly not less, but very different than these girls from 2-3 years old coming to Canada, right? Their perspectives are very different. How we approach these participants are the same, but how we receive their information is different, because the Chinese youth cannot speak for, let's say, a youth from Siwa who comes from maybe a place that has some sort of traditions that are not accepted really right now still. Just as an example, right? We had to really understand unbiasedly how their current immigrant identity is impacting their approach to their life and their mental health, which is very different. The only thing we specified was you have to be between 15 to 25 years old. That is what Alberta recognizes as youth. So that was the only piece that we wanted to be a bit rigid about. In terms of self-identification as an immigrant, we leave it up to them, because who are we to say, you're not an immigrant, you've lived here for 20 years. If you feel like you are an immigrant, then you are, right? We don't have a say. That was the only rigid protocol we had. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've heard about the methods and the type of research you did. You had your surveys. You conducted focus groups through doing the James Lennon Alliance priority setting. Would you like to share the results from your study? What did you learn from this study?
So firstly, I wanted to talk about the difference between the in-person focus groups, the focus group, and the virtual. What the biggest learning I found was, first of all, this was Brooks, the area of Brooks, which is a very small town in Alberta. It's a rural area. The demographic is majorly more Caucasian. However, the first thing we do before we start a focus group is we get them to sign their consent form, because we cannot proceed until we have the consent from these youth to, take their perceptions into account. And so we tried a couple or even more times to get the signatures of these youth. We would send the consent forms online. Well, these youth did not have access to much technology over there. That was one issue. Then the second time we emailed the form to the organizers there. There was a printer issue. They tried so hard, because these kids really wanted to be a part of, improving quality of life for themselves and others. So then Tiffany and I decided, along with Maria's input, to actually drive over to Brooks. It was over a couple hours of a drive. And Tiffany and I got there, and it was a community center in Brooks. Well, when we entered, it was all immigrants from Africa, various areas of Africa, obviously. A lot of youth who spoke Eritrea, from Eritrea, Somalia, etc. What was unique was all these kids were in a big room just doing their homework, not a technological device in sight. First of all, there was not even there was no Wi-Fi in that area. Just some learning I did was these youth, their parents actually come here to work in one of the big meat factories in Brooks. So these parents are working overtime, for very minimal pay, working very hard to essentially put food on the table for these kids. What do these kids do after school is they just go to the community hub until their parents are done work so then they could go home. Now, sometimes they're there for hours. All they're doing is homework, very respectable kids. Obviously they're going to be jovial and make jokes, etc. When I went in there, some of the youth, their disposition was very open, while some of the boys in particular were a bit more reserved. What I did differently was in the virtual focus groups was on like a screen. I would just put all the questions, right? The kids would view them all and decide in the chat box. But I had to think differently with Tiffany. So we actually wrote the questions down on cardboard papers, one question on each cardboard. And we stuck them all across the big community room with each question, and we gave them stickers. So green stickers for this should be a priority, and red stickers for this is not a priority. And there was only a limited amount of green stickers we gave, right? So they could really pick their priorities and it would be easy for us to analyze. Well, these kids, first of all, had a bit of a language barrier. So because I took on the skill that I am from an immigrant background, how to use more layman terms to get these youth to understand what I'm saying. So that really helped. And we gave them the independence to just walk around the room, and they would have a lot of questions for me and Tiffany. What does this mean? What this? And we would walk around really engaging. These kids were so happy. They finally had something really to do there, rather than just do their homework, something more productive in a way. And after that, after we got the stickers, then we had a big conversation. Well, why do you think this should be prioritized? Or, oh, you don't think this is a priority anymore based on what your peers are saying, We noted everything down. And for the first time in my focus groups, I was able to see smiles or frowns or like body language, pacing, discussions with each other, real inquisitive approach that I could observe rather than virtually, which was kind of a barrier in a way. Personally, I find focus groups in person are in a way much better because there's so much communication that is done physically, not verbally, right? So, in a nutshell, after we did the focus group, I asked you, do you have any questions? And they all came up. What is post-secondary? What do you do after high school in Canada? How I want to be a lawyer. What these youth did not have the information to progress further. These kids were so curious. They really wanted to because I felt they themselves felt they were stuck. They were stuck there. Based on other conversations I heard from the facilitators there and, the people who work to support these youth, the racism is a bit there in Brooks. Obviously, every small town has their negativities there, but sometimes these youth would have to walk an hour in the cold winters because the taxi drivers did not want to give them a ride to the schools. So these kids already felt a bit ostracized by their locality. Also, there was a bit of an unjust take on them being given the resources in the area themselves. There are resources for all different backgrounds of people. However, if you are not given the information for these resources, you do feel stuck. So that's why Brooks is an amazing town. They have a lot of resources for these youth. However, these youth are not receiving these resources because they're not being given that knowledge. So that was one big learning I had from small towns, in-person focus groups, and lack of knowledge being put out there for these youth. It might be right in their face, but if they're not told it, even from their own community, they're stuck. They're stuck.
Yeah, it's kind of like that expression, you don't know what you don't know. right?
Yeah.
And when you have the tools or you learn, certain things, then, it starts to open that up a little bit where you can start exploring different things and thinking about it differently. And so, yeah, it sounds a lot like there's resources, but how do you find them? Who shares this information with who? Is it teachers? Is it, how is this information being shared so that people can access these resources?
Mhm. And I'm glad you brought up teachers, Sandra, because to finish off that, my learnings from what were the results with the focus groups that I did with the youth, their priorities were very individually based, more down to their level, as in, how can I support my friends experiencing mental crisis? Uh, what supports are there for me and my peers? You know, things that they could implement practically themselves without any really big supports. So their findings in a nutshell was more individual based. Now the NGT, which was a nominal group technique, which is pretty much very similar to a James Lind Alliance approach, except instead of a discussion that you have with others on your priorities, a nominal group technique is where you actually are silent and you write down your priorities and then you give it to the facilitator, the researcher, and then they discuss it without saying, well, John said this. What do you think, Kat? It rather is more anonymized. So there's not, feelings of ill will that someone's opposing what you're saying, etc. So the NGT I did with the providers, right? And these adults actually had very different priorities than the youth. Their priorities were more upstream. Upstream as in, how can we better support them via schools, via organizations, via governmental supports, even in a way, more upstream. How does it trickle down to help these youth's mental health rather than the youth saying it starts off with the youth helping each other and helping themselves? So, very different perspectives. Who do we listen to? Well, we listen to both, but the whole point of this project was to engage youth in their own care. Obviously, we have to prioritize these youth when they're saying we need to get down to their, not down to their level, but go to their level and see their perspective that they really don't have the time to look at, well, the government policy did this, and then that went to the school board, and then the counselors. They just want quicker turnaround. And then obviously the adults are thinking more in a different lens, right? They're thinking more, well, it starts off from the top, right? That's how it works. Very interesting findings. The only similarity between both what the NGT adults said and the youth said was COVID did impact mental health quality. This is a historical artifact because how often does a pandemic happen now? But obviously, this pandemic made us realize for a small amount of people, it helped their mental health, right? For introverts like me, but for the general population, especially when you're social, that's how you make friends in high school and junior high and stuff. Well, when that's cut off and you're an immigrant and you're having issues with, for example, like the youth in Brook with technology, there's so much chaos going in your head, right? Very different result findings that I found. We take into account both, but I think we do need to start off with both, addressing policy with the governments, with the community organizations and stuff, but also in parallel, working with these youth, um, going to schools, doing talks, having little workshops, having little groups, just to hang out and talk, so they feel heard. But yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like the youth placed a lot of value or importance on the peer-to-peer connections. And I think, we as humans, we want to connect with one another. And it can be so isolating not being able to talk about that. And so I think the peer-to-peer would be very different than a youth talking to a teacher or even a psychologist, which is important, but it's a very different support. They might just need some peer-to-peer support and not necessarily psychiatric support, right? And by having those conversations with their peers, it just might help their mental health.
Yeah. For some youth who are from immigrant or refugee backgrounds, when they have a mental health crisis, their family seeks more cultural or religious avenues, sometimes in parallel with Western treatments, but also just with religious and cultural things. I even, a personal story, when I was going through a bit of a mental distress, because my parents were not as knowledgeable on mental health crises at that age, because I was their first child. We also sought out more of a religious figure to help heal me. Well, I mean, I wasn't healed after a couple of years, right? So I totally understood the struggle that these youth felt because, well, they're not getting better. Not saying that religious and cultural approaches are not good. They just should be in harmony with more supportive resources here. Definitely does not have to be psychiatric, which is more medical, clinical based, or psychological, because there is a stigma in the community itself, right? First of all, like, I don't know if you've heard, when someone is from a certain cultural background, they actually don't want to go to a physician from the same cultural background if they're a youth, because there's that fear that it's too close, you know? What do they tell their parents? Oh, respect, confident, anything, right? They actually seek other outlier supports, right? There's that innate stigma within the youth themselves. And embedded with that is the parents' innate stigma, that shared shame the parents might feel that, well, we came here to give you a better life. We came here, we're working our bums off. We're doing all these things. Why are you feeling the way you do? Well,
Mm-hmm.
parents, a perspective to displacement is very fair, but very different to someone who's young. There's no remedy for that. There just needs to be more support, more inquiry, and more peer-to-peer, like you said, Sandra. So yeah.
It is very interesting work that you're doing, and I think super important to understand. And as we know, mental health has so much stigma. So I think the next thing that I was thinking about, and maybe you can share a little bit more about where you've shared some of your findings so far.
Yeah, so I have presented in over about, let's say, over 8 conferences so far in the past couple of years, right
Mhm.
from the preliminary work all the way to now to the end. So just I'll give you two alternative conferences that I showcased in the past month. So I did the City of Calgary conference. Essentially, this was more less medicine, more what's going on in the government right now, what policies, what community organizations, what things can the government improve on in terms of health. So myself and Tiffany actually went there, and the people who approached my poster, which is what I presented with the findings and everything, my presentation were more community based. So I had a couple of ladies come from the Islamic support groups in Calgary, and they were so curious about, well, how can we implement or how can we have someone from your study like to represent and come to support the children, the youth in our who come and hang out, just so feel they don't feel alone, something like that. And the city of Calgary really get an understanding that, hey, we need to get more resources, even a bit more funding to these organizations so they can improve youth quality health. And then alternatively, just a couple weeks ago, I presented at the Children's Health Research Institute conference in Banff, Alberta. And it was more science clinical based in the sense that there was about 130 presentations there, and they were all across the board in terms of children and youth health. That entailed concussions in youth or anything. And then I was doing youth mental health, immigrant youth mental health. A word on the street is like I got a lot of audience there. Why? Because sometimes people just want to hear the most broad question, what priorities do a youth have for mental health? Because there's none right now, right? So just a few posters here and there. So I got a lot of audience there, a lot of curiosity. Somebody even asked me, if you had $1 million right now, what would you do to support this research? I never got that before from a pediatrician. And, I don't know if this was the right answer, but I said, I would actually fund more after school programs based on, because I worked for the city of Calgary for a long time, and I did after school programs in like a community called Dalhousie, which is by the University of Calgary, in the Calgary housing complex. So more low income youth. All the youth that came there were children and youth were of immigrant backgrounds, right? And they just would consistently come for 2 hours to do what? Just talk about current events, eat a couple snacks, and I felt like they were much happier. Maybe I'm biased, So if I had $1 million, I would practicality, like what the youth said, directly to their level, do something very minute like that. Obviously, that costs a lot of money, but if I had money for that, that's what I would implement, to the practical level with the city. Yeah. So
Just going back to the conference presentations, I wanted to congratulate you on the award that you won for the University of Calgary 3-minute thesis presentation, which is available on YouTube. And you talk a little bit about the work that you do in that presentation. This is what we're talking about today is part of your thesis work. I'm wondering if you would want to share the top 5 priorities that came from this work.
yes, sure. So essentially, the top priorities that we found, which was number one for these youth, was how can mental health be improved? I thought this was a great priority until I went to the conference in Banff, and she is like, one of the people who came to my presentation was like, well, that's very broad. And how is that relevant to just immigrant youth? That could be relevant to any youth in Canada and Alberta. How can mental health be improved? But for transparency's sake, that was the first priority immigrant youth had as well. But then we go down to the priority that these youth had, which was what resources exist specifically for immigrant and newcomer youth, ethnocultural youth, and refugees in Alberta. Now that's where we get to, that is their priority. They want to know what resources they are. Again, practically, individually, that they can help themselves or others. Thirdly, they asked, are there cultural differences in how individuals and communities can approach or seek treatment for mental health issues? Cultural differences is very key, and we could extrapolate that quite heavily. Cultural differences between, let's say, a Pakistani immigrant are very different from someone from Ukraine. Ukraine was an active war site. Pakistan, not so much right now. Just how can we allot resources specifically to cater to their mental health quality of life right now? So this was a very crucial question. This was actually ranked 3rd in the top priorities for these youth. And then again, we get more vague again. How does mental illness affect education, employment, and job opportunities? This is applicable to pretty much any youth in Alberta, whether they're immigrants or not. Lastly, how can I support someone struggling with mental health? Again, more vague, but this is one of the priorities that these youth chose. Just to compare with what the adults said was, how can schools better address mental health challenges? That was one of their priorities. How can communities reduce stigma to help youth access care? And lastly, what are the structural barriers to receiving care and how can we improve access? So really, again, very different priorities that they had, right? So those were the main findings if we get into like actual questions that these youth had. And so in terms of the 3-minute thesis that I participated in, this was just, I had exactly 3 minutes to say everything I said for the past hour. And I could really talk about this for days. It was extremely hard. But in a nutshell, this 3-minute thesis was a quick way for any general audience, anyone in the world, to get an idea of what work we're doing in Alberta right now to improve youth mental health. That's it. So this 3-minute thesis actually got a lot of engagement, and Global Health actually reached out to me. Global Health, which is a Calgary-based news company, they reached out. They did an article with about this. A lot of community organizations and conferences actually reached out to connect with me. And lastly, they opened up a mental health center in Calgary called The Summit. And The Summit is a new, specifically urgent care and research mental health center for children and youth. They have an emergency department there and then research-based, organizational-based stuff there. So they actually invited me to come represent the patient engagement team and really do a presentation over and over again to all the donors who contributed for this building to stand now. So I had a lot of opportunities for advocacy work regarding this subject, really getting it out there. At least I'm starting off with Calgary, have presented in Edmonton as well. In the future, I would love if I receive some sort of, funding support or anything to really travel back to Brooks, go to like Cold Lake, which is another place that we did it. Really connect, engage more with these youth themselves to let them know that, hey, we didn't leave you hanging. We want to improve your life. Just like, my life got improved after being in Canada for so long. So.
Amazing, Farwa, and it's so awesome to hear about your work. And I'm so happy that these opportunities are coming your way to share more broadly. And I think it's really important to, bring that awareness to your work. So just one final question. What was the best part of being able to do this work for you personally?
The best part was talking to these youth. I'll be honest, talking to the adults was fun and all, but something about the genuine, raw perspectives of youth, because they don't have that reservedness yet, right? So they really speak their minds. I learned so much from these youth. And so I want to really put this research out there, not wait 10 years for an implementation, really work towards like advocacy work and everything so we can really get this broad topic and branch off into more narrow topics. Refugee health, just refugees, because the experience refugees have with displacement is different than immigrants whose parents might come here just for work, right? There's so many nuances. And lastly, when I did my presentations, some of the judges actually asked me these questions. They're like, well, this is so broad. Well, it's broad right now because not a lot of it has been done. You have to start off broad to get more narrow, right? And then this is the base right now, this research, and then we're going to branch out, hopefully, maybe throughout my life, support others who are doing more nitty-gritty work with the base that I've worked on with Tiffany, Brian, and Maria. So.
Awesome. I'm so glad you're doing this work. I hope that you can continue it on and keep those ripples in the water going because, it is very important. So, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. It was wonderful talking to you and really great to hear about your work. Thanks, Farwa.
Thank you for the opportunity, Sandra, and thank you to the patient engagement team.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of PEP Talks, the Patient Engagement Podcast, brought to you by the Alberta Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research Patient Engagement Team. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you found it, and we hope you'll join us again for more interesting discussions about patient engagement in health research and healthcare.